Okay. Hi, everybody. It is fun to follow up Heather, and it's such an inspirational presentation with lots of gorgeous pictures, and mine is a little bit more doom and gloom, not as exciting to look at, but I think it is an important topic. I think a lot of us here in Minnesota or the Midwest deal with controlling buckthorn on our own properties or on our projects, and getting some tools that we can keep in our toolbox for how to manage it effectively and what to do when can kind of curb those infestations. So I'll talk about like, what is the problem with buckthorn? Why do we not want it on our property? It's a tree. So is it better than having nothing on our in our woodlands, or nothing vegetating our woodland understories? Not necessarily, maybe in some cases, but for the most part, buckthorn outcompetes native vegetation, native shrubs, and native tree resprouts. So we have a problem with revegetation when we have dense buckthorn understories. Another question we commonly hear is that doesn't it provide habitat? You know, I see birds eating it. Isn't it good food for birds? And that's not necessarily true either. I think in almost any case for wildlife, we want to provide diverse food resources and diverse habitat for cover, shelter. And maybe the most common complaint, especially from neighboring properties, is that people like the screening that buckthorn provides, and it certainly does provide screening in the form of a very dense, aggressive understory. So hopefully everybody knows what exactly the problems with buckthorn are, and we can talk here a little bit about how we can manage it more effectively without the use of chemicals. So today I'm not going to talk about managing buckthorn with chemicals at all. If you do have questions about it, my email will be at the end, so I can try to give you some more information about working through some of your individual site problems. So unfortunately, buckthorn, as an invasive species, it kind of has all of the worst qualities of invasive. So it grows really quickly. So in an individual growing season, you can go from just that new sprouted seedling up to a whip, and then, you know, a year later, a taller whip, and then the next growing season, you know, you have a shrub that's taller than you are. It also has a very long growing season. So it begins leafing out very early, and then the leaves stay on very late in the fall time. So well after a lot of the natives have already dropped their leaves. And then, like I mentioned, it does outcompete native understory, native shrubs, and native tree seedlings. So when we have a dense buckthorn understory, we have very little other diversity, especially, you know, depending on what level of infestation you're dealing with. So creating a management plan, especially when planning a non-chemical buckthorn management strategy, consider timing, what method you're going to use for removing the buckthorn, and what materials you might want to have on hand. Timing of buckthorn removal, you know, oftentimes consider late summer through the fall and into the winter, you know, depending on what kinds of work you're doing. Often recommended not to cut buckthorn in the springtime when the sap is flowing. But there's, you know, I kind of go over a few other ideas as I move through the presentation here, but it is certainly a multi-year commitment, especially like an organic site control is going to be a big commitment that we're going to want to follow through with, you know, year after year. So creating a plan for removal, at a minimum, you're going to want to at least remove the berry producing plants as soon as you realize you have a problem. Cut those plants prior to the berries really maturing, so that when you cut the stem and the tree falls over or shrub falls over, ideally the berries aren't falling off as you're either dragging or cutting it up. So if you can cut the berry producing plants, you know, later in the summer or early in the fall, remove that seed source. So that's going to be, you know, your first step. Really identify the site see what you have going on for how heavy of an infestation are you dealing with, how many stems per 100 square feet do you have. Can kind of look at a 10 by 10 area and see how many stems you have, kind of decide how big of a problem you're working with. And of course, all of these, I try to talk about all different scales of projects here, because I know a lot of people tuning in to the conference, some are either working on like a backyard type level, or some are dealing with 100 or plus acres. So hopefully I can provide some interesting insight on all of those different scales. But so at a minimum, remove those berry producing plants, and then after that, consider removing the larger tree material and kind of make a plan for how you're going to do that. And then plan for follow-up control. So even at the point where you are thinking about cutting the larger material, know in the back of your mind that you're going to have quite a bit of follow-up control, and kind of create a plan for that for subsequent growing seasons. And then, as I mentioned, the timing, cut late summer or fall if you can. If you have a large site or a really heavy infestation, you're going to use equipment, something like a forestry mower, forestry tractor, forestry mounted skid loader attachment. Do this type of work in the winter when the soils are frozen, so you're not damaging that soil layer. If you can work on frozen ground conditions, that's something really important to consider. Minimizing soil disturbance and just protecting that soil. For small material, anything smaller than 3/8 of an inch or so, and you can kind of cheat that number one way or another, depending on how strong you're feeling or what your soils are like. You can pull the smaller material earlier in the growing season. So I think that it's kind of a nice plan as you're kind of identifying your buckthorn problem and moving through the site, you can hand pull these smaller seedlings, throughout the growing season. These are going to pull and be kind of a one and done. You are going to create some small soil disturbance, but we can mitigate that later as part of the larger plan. But you can do this throughout the growing season. So especially if you're planning to revegetate immediately after removing the larger stem, and you're going to do everything kind of in one growing season, remove these seedlings earlier then you're not seeding and trying to revegetate and then going back and pulling smaller buckthorn. So if you can try to do some hand pulling earlier on, I think it can be beneficial later. They do pull pretty easily when they're these tiny ones, like in my picture, but as they get bigger, they can be kind of a pain to pull. They put a lot of root material down, and it's kind of fibrous, so it's a lot to pull. But something after a rain, when the soils are moist, can be helpful. But it's a good way to get the smaller material removed, and as kind of a final option. You're not going to have to deal with resprouts if you're hand pulling. So sort of related to that is the weed wrench. That can create quite a bit of soil disturbance, but again, if you have a plan for revegetation, that can be okay. But when you do disturb the soil as part of your buckthorn removal plan, you do have a greater chance of promoting growth from any berries that may have been on site. So just watch out for that, and have kind of management of future sprouts in part of your plan. These are available for rent by some outfits, so you can buy them online. Kind of just a helpful tool. It uses leverage off the ground and a strong operator to push and pull the roots out of the ground. And like the one shown in the picture there, you can imagine it does create a bit of soil disturbance immediately after pulling. If you can kind of stomp the soil back down, that's good. But moving into probably what's the most common removal method for anything larger than, say, a 1/4 acre or so, is the cutting with a chainsaw or a brush cutter. And in the industry here, we often use brush cutters. You can move through a large area quickly, and I think it's often a little bit safer than a chainsaw. And you can cut, fairly decent sized material, especially when you're working with buckthorn with these brush cutters. And as you get to the material shown in the top right picture, that's obviously going to need a chainsaw and create quite a large stump. to the bottom left is a picture of a cut stump. It's actually cut at a bit of an angle, which is the kind of a no-no. It's great to cut a flush stump. But then it's a very common picture of what the resprouts look like. They kind of come out in a crown around the stump. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, buckthorn, has the qualities of all the worst invasive species, and it is really aggressive at resprouting. And it does not resprout just one sprout, it often resprouts in this full crown of branches reaching upward. So, and it grows quickly again. So that is part of the follow-up control that we need to consider when planning a buckthorn project, is that most of the stumps that you're going to have are going to do some form of resprouting and continued growth after cutting. When using this larger equipment like chainsaw and brush cutter, I just wanted to mention not to forget your personal protective equipment. It's a bit of a safety hazard working out in the woods with chainsaw and brush cutter. And if you've ever worked in a really dense buckthorn understory, it can be hard to maneuver. So definitely take your time. I know it's a lot of work, but take your time, move slowly through the woods, and use your best patience because it's a bit daunting. But so for like larger scale sites or really heavy infestations, using a forestry mower, and the one I have pictured here is just one of our larger forestry mowers, but you can mount a forestry mower head on a smaller skid loader and move through a smaller site. But the nice thing about using a forestry mower, which is a drum that spins with like carbide teeth and just chews up the tree material or shrub material, and with a good operator you can be very precise. You can move through a woods without damaging native trees and native shrub species, and that's great. Obviously, when you're going to move something really large in like this forestry tractor, you need room to turn around and navigate. So you have to select your equipment based on the density of the native tree and shrubs already existing on site. But you can move through an area fairly quickly. So, if you're dealing with a site that's larger than 3 acres or a site that has a really dense infestation, this can be a really effective way of removing the material. So one, it shreds the stumps, which can actually impact seedling or resprouts, not seedlings, but the stump resprouts, because it opens the stumps up, opens the roots up to some air, and it often, you don't see the same kind of crown resprouts that you do from a flush cut stump. It's a little bit anecdotal, but I think that it's definitely evident on some sites that you aren't seeing the same density of resprouts between forestry mowed sites and flush cut stump sites. The other thing it does is shreds the buckthorn material. So this isn't great for berry producing plants. If you have a ton of berry producing plants, it can be advantageous to cut them out ahead of time. Because if you're going to forestry mow, that means you're going to leave all of the material on site. You're not having a plan for cutting and chipping, hauling away and chipping, or creating burn piles and burning. You're just shredding the material on site, which can be good for soil erosion control and things like that, but it is not great if you're mulching up a lot of berries on site. It's can be something that you have to deal with in part of your revegetation plan, especially on large scale sites. It's not really practical to go in and remove material prior to dispatching a forestry mower. I mean, that would probably consume a large part of a budget, but just something to keep in mind. Anyway, so it's doing kind of 2 services, and one is cutting the larger material, but it is also mulching it up in a way that you don't have to go back and figure out how to deal with the woody stems that you have. So like I said, whether you're going to chip it or cut it and burn it or drag it to be hauled away, this kind of takes care of all of those. And it also provides a really clean slate for revegetation. So I really like that. It can be part of a management plan that involves like goat browsing, because it opens up the site so well, and everything, all of the resprouts then will be at the same kind of growing condition. They're all going to be you're going to have those whips flush up the next year, and they're all going to be the same height. They're all going to be kind of that perfect browsing height. And then the year after, they're going to, you know, kind of just, again, be on the same level. So that's a really good benefit and a good pairing between those services. So once you've removed the larger buckthorn material, what happens next? It's unfortunately the job is not done on most accounts. So, you know, you're going to see something like this resprout in the picture the next growing season if you don't do something with the stumps. And what this looks like is going to depend on the level of infestation you're dealing with and the number of berry seeds in the soil and also the number of native seed species in the soil. Do you have any kind of soil bank for native seeds, or are ferns going to come through? You know, are you going to get lucky and have some native resprouts after you've removed the buckthorn canopy? I would sure hope so, but that's certainly not the case on a lot of sites, unfortunately. So you have to consider what what your plan for follow-up control will be. Are you going to seed the project area? Are you planning to continue mowing? Are you going to cover the stump? There's a couple methods for that. Are you considering goat browsing? I'm going to talk about all of these now in reverse order. Goat browsing is an awesome resource. It's just really gained a lot of popularity in the last 10 years or so, and that's great for taking care of those resprouts. So goats can't tackle the initial infestation when it's kind of material larger than 6 feet or so. So it's going to look something like this picture here, where the goats are climbing and reaching what they can, but they aren't able to tackle that upper canopy, which, you know, when you're dealing with buckthorn, isn't going to get you very far when you're just chewing up the lower branches. This process almost always needs to be repeated. So if you're planning or budgeting for goat browsing as part of a buckthorn removal project, consider the initial removal and then 3 growing seasons or so of goat browsing, you know, following that. And again, all of this depends on the level of infestation that you're looking at on your project. So it can be cost prohibitive on a small scale, but because, you know, mobilizing the animals and setting up the fencing, particularly setting up the fencing, adds to the cost on these small scale sites. And then, you know, again, repeating the process. So always plan in your budget, you know, that it's going to have to be repeated. The nice thing about having goats on your property is that they will manage other woody problematic species or problematic understory species in general. A lot of people ask if goats eat poison ivy, and they do. So that's great. You can consider, you know, something like that when planning your buckthorn project. Are you gonna, you know, gain some additional benefits from having some browsing? And we've seen, you know, some really incredible results from putting goats on to browse understory and seeing the regen from species that we didn't expect to see, didn't know would be in the soil bank, and that's really exciting to see. So you can bring in, you know, these herbivores and experience something that is unexpected and not part of, you know, a plan that you could have guessed. So there's definitely some benefits and some things that you may not be able to plan for, but that's kind of all part of it. And then it is great PR, you know, putting goats into either public spaces or just telling people about it. It's exciting. It's still exciting, you know, even after doing it for several years. People they like to see them. It's a good story. It's a good land use. And so that definitely could be part of your plan for your follow-up control. So this is something I always like to mention, especially for smaller scale projects. And when we're talking to, you know, a group like this that is such a wide ranging audience, is some of these smaller scale techniques. So buckthorn baggy is I think there's technically like a brand in Minnesota, some company that produces buckthorn baggies, but you can also just cut your own like contractor bags and use zip ties. And in this method, you cut the stump with some stump material remaining like at least 3 inches. And then you zip tie very tightly the square of black plastic. It's again kind of like those heavy contractor bags. And you zip tie that over the stump completely, all the way to like the root crown, and cover all of the area that's visible to the light, and they have some, the edges kind of splayed out so that the soil just around the base of the shrub, the buckthorn shrub, is covered just a bit. And if you have resprouts after you've applied what's the buckthorn baggie, then you need to remove the buckthorn baggie and cut the sprouts, and then put it on again, either tighter or maybe a larger square. But this can be practical on a smaller scale, and there's no reason not to try it. If you've never tried it before and had bad luck, then I would encourage you to try it out. The similar method is the tin can method, and that really involves like an old soup can, and you cut the stump buckthorn again about 3 inches, and you take a can that's larger in diameter than the buckthorn stump by a couple of inches, or at least 1 inch on either side. Cut some holes in the can a couple of inches from the top of the can, flip it over, shove it over the stump, and then bury the can at least like 1 inch into the soil, and then you nail the can straight into the buckthorn stump. And again, if the stump resprouts, then remove the can and actually switch to a larger can and try again. But it's a similar method. We're robbing that stump of light resources, and any of the resprouts that try to grow can be kind of set back pretty drastically. So it's worth trying on a small scale. Some people have had luck with it, and some people haven't, or have had bad luck. So it can be hit or miss, but it's definitely worth mentioning. Continued mowing is another method, and it's the method for mowing can depend on your future plans, or if you have revegetation plans, but you can mow with like a brush mower over subsequent growing seasons, like a DR mower or something like that, or a brush hog. And the stumps are going to resprout for an unknown number of years, right? And the berries are going to grow from the soil. So we are dealing with regrowth for, like I mentioned, an unknown number of years, but I don't think continued mowing is a great method all on its own. But when combined with a revegetation plan, I think it can be useful, especially on sites that can't be burned. Another option for revegetation, besides revegetating with a native cover, which is primarily what I'm going to talk about here in just a few minutes, is seeding with a low maintenance, like a fescue blend. And this is something that people do to expand maybe their usable yard space, or just as an extension of woodland, like an open woodland understory. But here in Minnesota, we have so many native species that this isn't necessarily like the only or best option. But if you want to go with something that's short and that's easy to manage resprouts, then this is a decent option for that. And you can use a bee lawn that has some of those forbs in it as well, or just the low growth fescue blend, which is actually pretty shade tolerant. I mentioned earlier you could do nothing after removing the buckthorn, the initial infestation. Perhaps you have a really cool native seed bank, but chances are it could probably use a little bit of help. And when I say do nothing, I definitely mean have a plan for managing the resprouts, like mowing at every other growing season, in the fall or springtime, and then consider some of those things that Sarah and Heather talked about yesterday about mowing high to provide habitat for pollinators and not mowing until soil temperatures are consistently above 50 degrees and things like that. So consider the pollinators when you're planning on any sort of mowing activities, but doing your job to also manage those resprouts. My favorite thing to talk about is overseeding or to revegetate with native species. So you can use diverse seed mixes and ideally compete with the buckthorn resprouts, reduce the future buckthorn seed germination. Native species are well tolerant to fire. It can be burned in future growing seasons, and so the native herbaceous cover can help provide fuel for that prescribed burn. That can be really a useful tool to reduce resprout numbers and also provide a more diverse habitat. So if you're dealing with a site that has a really heavy infestation or maybe a really large site, so you have a little bit of a more substantial budget that you're working with, consider something like a buckthorn replacement seed mix or just a lower diversity but good native cover, something that's quick establishing, and this is going to provide fuel for a prescribed burn, but also again that cover for reducing or providing competition, reducing resprouts and reducing buckthorn seed germination. If you can introduce more diversity, it's always a good thing, right? So we're promoting more diverse habitat, providing more floral resources. If you look at our native species here in Minnesota for our woodland herbaceous species, we have so many spring blooming species, which is very important for overwintering pollinators and those returning for migration, but those spring floral resources. And I think, Heather covered so many of our tree and shrub species that provide a lot of spring nectar and pollen resources, but the native herbaceous plants do as well. And then, great summer blooming species, and then that also important fall and nectar resources as well. So if you're working on a smaller scale, revegetating with a diverse seed mix can provide just so many benefits. And, if you are able to do this revegetation work soon after the initial infestation is sort of under control, or after you've removed the larger material and just start creating that competition for resources, that can be really advantageous in the long run. So if you're looking at kind of a 3 to 5 year plan, if you're able to get that seed down sooner, you know that native species are a little bit slower establishing, so we're going to just give them a little bit of a heads up and start growing sooner by planting them soon after that initial removal. And if you are going to do something like bring goats onto a project for browsing, you can actually add that native seed soon after the initial removal, bring the goats on for however long, and soon, or right before you are planning to pull the goats off of a site, you can seed your native seed mix as what's called a trample seeding, and actually have them help provide some of that good seed to soil contact. So it's just one possibility. These are some photos from the last couple of years of the woodland seed mix on a couple of different sites, and so you can see just a good amount of diversity after just a couple of growing seasons. This is an early stages of the germination, just after the first couple of growing seasons. So you're not seeing the full seed mix diversity yet, but you can see, some forb species and some grasses and some good cover being established. So it's helpful in reducing that buckthorn cover ideally. And if you have a little bit more sun, you could consider a Savannah seed mix. That's going to require a little bit more sun, maybe more like a 50-50 cover, but once you remove that buckthorn canopy, you can kind of reassess your site and see what kind of sun is reaching the soil surface in the afternoon. Are you getting some dappled sunlight in the afternoon? You could consider Savannah. All right, so I'm just gonna kind of buzz through a couple of things here. Heather talked about so many native shrubs and trees, and there are a lot available. So consider native shrubs as part of your revegetation plan. If you're planning to mow your site, repeatedly, if you have a really heavy, batch of resprouts or really heavy berry content in your seed bank, then adding shrubs maybe is something you want to do after a couple of years of mowing those buckthorn resprouts. But they can be super good at outcompeting buckthorn for sunlight resources. So that is all I have. So I kind of sped through a lot of material, but as you think of questions, if I'm sure we won't be able to get to all of them, but feel free to email me. My email is here on the page.